Welcome back to Whispers in the Dark, where we tell the most mysterious and spine-chilling stories in the world. I'm your host, Eddie, and tonight I'll be narrating a gripping paranormal crime story that will leave you questioning the thin line between the natural and supernatural realms. Buckle up and turn the lights down low as we enter a world of sacrifices, dark rituals, and eerie encounters that defy explanation. It's time for Sinister Sacrifices. Father Thomas Murphy couldn't take his eyes off the gruesome scene. The victim's body lay contorted on the cold, damp ground. A pentagram had been carved into her chest. He'd seen this before. Her name was Charlotte Harper, Detective Sarah Larson said, while examining the area. The crime scene was a chilling sight, set in a local park, just almost immediately beside a children's playground. An eerie mist clung to the ground, as if trying to hide the gruesome scene from the world. Charlotte Harper's body looked as if she'd been tossed aside. Like a rag doll, the gruesome pentagram carved into her chest stood out in stark contrast to her pale skin, the edges of the symbol still oozing fresh blood. Father Murphy approached cautiously, his hands clasped together in a mixture of concern and sorrow. Detective Larson briefly looked up from her work, acknowledging his presence before returning her attention to the ground. Some of the officers in the precinct believed this could be a religious thing. You know, with the pentagram and all. Her voice was steady and analytical. But I don't think so. It seems more like the work of a sociopathic sadist to me. I think he did this to torture her and then ran off. She paused for a moment, glancing at the mutilated body before continuing. If there was a genuine religious motive, wouldn't the body be handled with more care? There should be an altar or something, shouldn't there? The way she's been left here so brutally and haphazardly just doesn't add up. Father Murphy nodded thoughtfully, his eyes filled with deep sadness as he looked at Charlotte's lifeless form. No. I've seen this pattern before, Father Murphy said. His voice trembled. This killer made a pact with a demon. Father Murphy was an exorcist and a consultant for the police in cases involving things that some people might have a hard time believing. The soft, wet earth beneath Charlotte's body bore the evidence of a struggle, with footprints and scuff marks that would be clearly analyzed for clues. Larson had an impeccable record for solving cases. Between her insight and intuition, it was hard to get one over on her. Detective Larson raised her eyebrows. You're suggesting that a demon is behind these murders? Not directly, Father Murphy explained. The killer believes they're fulfilling a contract with a demon, one that grants them power and protection in exchange for the souls of their victims. How can you be so sure? Check her mouth. If I'm correct, there's a small paper tied with a black ribbon under her tongue. Detective Larson looked skeptical, but decided to check. She carefully put on a pair of gloves and gently opened Charlotte's mouth. As she lifted the young woman's tongue, she found a small, rolled-up piece of parchment tied with a thin, black ribbon. What is this? Detective Larson asked as she carefully removed the parchment from the victim's mouth. Father Murphy stepped closer. His expression was grave. This is a sigil, a symbol used in demonic pacts. It's placed in the mouth of the victim to connect the deceased to the demon. Detective Larson studied the parchment, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of the strange symbols drawn upon it. Father Murphy continued, Finding this sigil here confirms my suspicions. The killer isn't your garden variety sociopath. They're moving with intention, believing they're gaining powers from the demonic forces they serve. In short, they are going to strike again. Detective Larson couldn't believe she was really taking this seriously. She didn't even want Father Murphy at the crime scene. The higher-ups pressured her into calling him. She wasn't the first, Detective Larson said as she got up. Another body, a male, was found 3 days ago. How are we supposed to catch someone that thinks they're working for a demon? Let me see that. Father Murphy donned a pair of gloves and examined the symbol. I can't be certain right now, but it looks like something is missing. Just then, a chilling scream pierced the air, echoing through the park. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the playground. Detective Larson and Father Murphy exchanged a concerned glance before sprinting towards the source of the scream. As they reached the playground, they found a terrified mother clutching her child, pointing to the edge of the park where a shadowy figure was quickly disappearing into the darkness. There was a man here. I was just walking by, and it was so quiet, I must have accidentally scared him. He turned around so fast. His face was covered in blood. He was looking that way. The woman pointed to where Father Murphy and Detective Larson just were. He was watching us, Detective Larson whispered, her eyes locked on the retreating figure. She quickly grabbed her radio, calling for backup. This is Detective Larson. We have a suspect on the run, last seen heading north out of Rolling Hills Park near the playground entrance, requesting immediate assistance. As she spoke, she took off after the shadowy figure, sprinting through the park. The suspect moved with an unnerving grace. It was like he knew the park like the back of his hand. He expertly weaved through the trees and managed to scale a stone wall. Detective Larson stared up at the wall in disbelief. How the hell? Just then, Father Murphy came running up behind her, completely out of breath. Give me the paper with the sigil. I can find out exactly who he's trying to summon. Give you the paper? Hand over a major piece of evidence? I'm only trying to help. Yeah? Then why didn't you run? You didn't even try to help me catch him. And now he got away. You're not being fair. I'm old. And if you couldn't catch him, there's no way I could have. I made sure the woman and her daughter were okay. I'm not an officer. Detective Larson paused for a moment, struggling with her frustration at letting the suspect slip through her fingers. All right, let's find out who or what this guy is trying to summon. Detective Larson handed the paper with the sigil to Father Murphy, and they went to his office. At the office, Detective Larson stood there in awe, looking at all of the books on the shelves. That's a lot of books. Oh? They're not mine, he replied while looking for a specific volume. Not yours? No. These belong to the church. Of course, but you do have access to them whenever you want. That I do, he replied with a smile. He began flipping through the pages of a huge leather-bound book, his eyes glancing between the piece of parchment found at the crime scene and the book in front of him. Here it is! He excitedly exclaimed. Detective Larson leaned in closer, curious to see what Father Murphy had discovered. On the page, an illustration of the sigil found at the crime scene was accompanied by ancient text describing its purpose and the demon it was associated with. It says here the sigil is linked to Ba-El-Zephon, a demon that thrives on chaos and destruction. The killer's attempting to summon him through a series of ritualistic sacrifices, each marked with the pentagram. So the more victims he claims, the closer he gets to summoning the demon. Detective Larson felt a shiver run down her spine. Father Murphy, how many people do you think would have access to books like this? I'm sorry? Well, even you, an exorcist, needed this book to tell you exactly the demon the sigil was connected to. This information is specialized. Maybe our killer is a priest. Father Murphy's eyes furrowed. He was clearly bothered by what Detective Larson said, but couldn't argue with her. It was true. If there was no religious component to the case, what would you be looking for? Detective Larson collected her thoughts for a moment. There were signs of a struggle at tonight's crime scene. He didn't feel the need to ambush his victim. We know she was abducted on the streets hours earlier. This, combined with him watching us, says that he's confident. The way he moved through the trees tells me that he had an escape route, showing he can plan ahead. The way he treated his victim's corpse suggests that he has no remorse. Both victims were white. Our subject is probably white. We know he's fit. He's probably a firstborn, But if not, he's high in the birth order, more than likely with younger siblings. He probably has a job where people answer to him. Father Murphy took a break from his text and looked up at Detective Larson. And when you add in the religious component, we can add in he's very detail-oriented. And why is he doing this, Detective? Because he wants to make sure he can't be overpowered. He initially presents as a masochist, but he's actually a power reassurance killer. And according to this text, the ritual cannot be broken up into pieces. There's an altar somewhere. He had to build it before the first kill. What does that mean? It means he has to guard it. If the altar is disrupted, the ritual is over. He'd need to start over. Couldn't it be at his house? No, it has to be performed on consecrated ground. As meticulous as the killer has been, he would have known. Detective Larson and Father Murphy knew they had to find the consecrated ground where the killer had built the altar. If they found the altar, they would find the killer and put a stop to all this madness. They began researching possible locations in the city, focusing on churches, cemeteries, and other sacred sites. But none of them would work. The ritual required a significant amount of space, making it difficult to hide. Suddenly, Detective Larson had a realization. That old abandoned building on the outskirts of town, wasn't that once a church? I thought it was a school. I think it started as a church, then became a school later on. Do you think it would be spacious enough for the ritual? Yes, it definitely would. Father Murphy gathered some things, and the two set off for the old building. By the time they arrived, it was nearly 3 a.m. From the outside, they could see someone inside the dilapidated structure. Moving cautiously, they snuck in. The interior was nothing short of terrifying. The dilapidated structure was a haunting testament to its former glory. The once sturdy wooden beams were now rotting and crumbling, barely supporting the collapsing ceiling. Broken glass windows lined the walls. The killer had further transformed the space to accommodate his sinister ritual. In the center of the room stood a large, makeshift altar, draped with a black cloth and covered in burning candles. Surrounding the altar was a meticulously drawn circle, marked with symbols and runes that seemed to pulse with dark energy. A collection of bizarre and unsettling artifacts had been gathered for the ritual. A chalice filled with what appeared to be blood, an assortment of ancient-looking knives and daggers, and stacks of old leather-bound books containing forbidden knowledge of demonic incantations and rites. The air smelled like a mix of burning herbs and the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. The room had become a nightmarish blend of the sacred and the profane. The killer was in the midst of performing the ritual, his back turned to the priest and detective, but it was evident he knew they were there. "You're both too late," he taunted, as Detective Larson reached for her gun. The killer began to laugh maniacally, still not facing them. "What good would demon magic be if you could put an end to it with a mere gun? Give me a few moments, and I'll be right over." Father Murphy's confusion was evident. This doesn't make sense. He needed to sacrifice at least 3 people. The strong, the smart, and the innocent. At that moment, the demon-possessed killer raised his hands, causing a body previously hidden by debris to levitate. He gestured towards Detective Larson and Father Murphy, and the body flew towards them, landing at their feet. Another woman, her chest exposed, revealing a pentagram carved into her flesh. An aura of power radiated from the killer. "He'll finish completing the ritual soon. He seems to have already gained some power." "Some?" "Yes, he's not at full power yet. That's why he's still in the circle. If we break that circle, it'll weaken his connection to the demon." Larson immediately began grabbing nearby debris and started hurling it at the circle. This angered the demon-possessed killer. "Fool!" With the simple gesture, the demon was able to hurl all the debris back to Detective Larson. Overwhelmed, she fell to the ground. In her anger, she pulled out her service weapon and shot at the circle, creating a nice, clean scratch right through it, disrupting its integrity. The killer, seeing the circle was broken, quickly began to chant. In response, Father Murphy pulled a chalice from his bag, filled it with holy water, and started chanting as he slowly approached the killer. The killer's focus began to waver, and he accidentally began repeating Father Murphy's words. Suddenly, the killer screamed in agony. His connection to the demon continued to weaken, and he dropped to his knees. In desperation, the killer offered himself over to the demon in exchange for the power to kill those who dared to stop it. He pulled out a knife, plunged it into himself, and collapsed. Everything went silent. Detective Larson still had her service weapon out as she slowly approached. Not sure if he was dead or alive. She called out, "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to you. Do you understand your rights?" The killer began to silently rise. His movements were loose and fluid, as if guided by an unseen force. But his eyes glowed with an unnerving red light. "Detective, be careful. He may still be under the demon's influence." Larson stopped moving closer, her gun aimed steadily at the now standing killer. His eerie red eyes locked onto hers. She had all of his focus. In a voice now distorted and unnaturally deep, he spoke to them. "You think your human laws can contain me? I've been granted the power of the demon, and you both will suffer for your interference." Father Murphy, knowing the danger they faced, began to recite an exorcism prayer, his voice unwavering and filled with conviction. As the priest's words filled the room, the killer's body began to convulse. The demon fought to retain control of its newly acquired body. All at once began to charge at Father Murphy. Larson seized the opportunity and fired her weapon at the killer. The killer collapsed at Father Murphy's feet, the red glow in his eyes flickering and fading. He was lifeless, and the room fell silent once more. As they stood in the middle of the aftermath of the horrifying events, Detective Larson looked over at Father Murphy and said, "You know, I don't think I'll be including the possession and exorcism in my report. Might raise a few eyebrows at the precinct." Father Murphy laughed and replied, "Likewise, my child. I'll omit the gun and shooting from my account. I'll mention you assisted with the exorcism. The church already won't be too thrilled about that detail." They shared a knowing glance, acknowledging the unspoken bond forged between them in the face of such darkness. Larson offered Murphy a ride back to the city, but Murphy, ever the diligent priest, opted to stay behind and perform a cleansing ceremony to purify the desecrated grounds. "I appreciate the offer, Detective, but I have to make sure no trace of evil remains here. I'll arrange for a ride with another officer once I'm done. Take care, Father, and if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." With warm smiles, the two parted ways. And with that, we bring this thrilling episode of Whispers in the Dark to a close. Our tale of Father Murphy and Detective Larson has hopefully reminded us that often the greatest solutions come from a collaboration of multiple disciplines. In a world full of echo chambers, more and more people are making the mistake of exclusively trusting one discipline, like science or religion. It's important to remember that a balanced approach can lead to the most profound and successful outcomes. It would be silly to substitute religious texts for scientific manuals, or to try to understand the depths of the human heart and soul solely through a biology textbook. As our story demonstrated, some challenges are bigger than a single discipline and require a diverse range of knowledge and skills to overcome. Let tonight's paranormal crime story be a lesson to us all. Collaboration and open-mindedness are the key to unlocking the mysteries of our world. Thank you for joining me tonight. Whether you actively know it or not, you are so special, and I hope you have a peaceful evening. But as you probably already know, on this show, sweet dreams are not guaranteed. Good night.